now accept the idea that the bombing only ends when Milosevic complies. Given Milosevic's record of breaking his word,
reported what they saw in infrared.
At this time, I wasn't sure if there was enemy here or not.
In daylight, the pilot in an Apache helicopter can pick out an individual soldier at 3 miles away and fire at him.
These will pick up where my hand movement is, set it down to all the computers, and then point the gun wherever I look.
When the pilot puts on his helmet, he seems to become part of the machine. The 30-millimeter gun moves in tandem with his head. The gun, the Hellfire missiles, and the rockets mean the Apache can be devastating against ground forces. At night, they cannot be seen well, but they can see.
The key thing is that they can help shape a battlefield very quickly.
Lieutenant Colonel Frank Ippolito commands the battalion in this operation.
Control and eyes on the cab.
He says the Apaches were originally intended to fight as part of a combined ground and air team. But since then, they have adapted to fight sometimes deep in enemy territory, as they would in Kosovo, which can be more dangerous.
If the only focus for the enemy is looking up in the air and looking for you, and they don't have to look to their left and right, then they can put the resources looking up. I would say if it's employed by itself, it would stand a reason that it'd be much more vulnerable.
In fact, as part of these war games, one missile hit was registered against an Apache, which in a real war would have brought it down. Aram Roston, CNN, Fort Campbell, Kentucky.
They have come out of their camouflage to conduct operations, so they have become exposed to our aircraft. That provides us with what General Judge 2 days ago called a target-rich environment. And you have seen the impact in the cumulative damage that has been sustained.
The NATO strikes.
That has brought us to this point.
Privately, some aides tell CNN the airstrikes may be modified to give Serbian forces an easier opportunity to pull out. They say the next 24 to 48 hours will be critical in determining whether the endgame has finally begun.
We have some words which need to be more fully clarified. They are only words, they are not actions. We've seen words before.
U.S. officials say critical details remain to be finessed, including a Serbian willingness to pull all of its 40 to 50,000 military, paramilitary, and police forces out of Kosovo. They also say NATO must still fine-tune the command and control structure for its 50,000-member peacekeeping force in Kosovo. Russia has yet to agree to place its troops under an overall NATO umbrella similar to what exists in Bosnia, though U.S. officials say the Russians are close.
This is however, that the Kosovars would disarm.
Serb
still launching strikes, and there is as yet no evidence Serb troops have stopped fighting or begun pulling out of Kosovo. The man who brokered the deal estimates it will be a few more days before the bombs stop falling.
It would be in days, and very few days, that I understand that the suspension of the war activities, in other words, the pause in the bombing, would take place.
16,000 NATO peacekeeping troops, mainly British and French, are in Macedonia. 2,000 U.S. Marines are aboard ships waiting for the order to move into Kosovo. But first, NATO and Yugoslav military officials have to agree on how it's going to work. How Serb forces are supposed to withdraw when the bombing makes it impossible for them to move without being hit.
There will be no action taken that would in any way impede their full withdrawal. Until such time as we're satisfied that they intend to fully comply with the agreement, then the air campaign will continue.
NATO can call off the bombing, but who will call off the guerrillas of the Kosovo Liberation Army? NATO will have to move fast to fill the vacuum left by the retreating Serbs.
NATO peacekeeping. Our forces from Kosovo, the repatriation of all Kosovar deportees and refugees, the deployment of international peace-enforcing troops, including from NATO and Russia. With the promise of Russian participation in the planned peace force, there's confidence the United Nations will give NATO the mandate the EU wants to protect ethnic.
But as U.S. officials were cautioning, the devil is in the details, and there could still be trouble with them. For example, the plan says the UN Security Council, where Russia has a veto, will decide on Kosovo's interim government. The Serbs believe that will give them some key leverage.
The role of UN is re-emphasized.
The plan also leaves many details yet to be worked out. When will Serb forces start to withdraw? What is a verifiable withdrawal that would prompt NATO to stop bombing? When will NATO and other peacekeeping forces start moving into Kosovo? And will Russia be part of the peacekeeping force?
We, the United States, and I think this is a view shared by all of our allies, think that it would be a very good thing if Russia is part of that.
U.S. officials point to the way Russian and American troops have worked together in Bosnia, keeping the peace, as a model for Kosovo. But there is no agreement yet. There is also the question of the Kosovo Liberation Army. How will its leaders react? Are they willing to be disarmed, as called for in the plan?
The Kosovo Albanians are not consulted. It's a big mistake, and that's another reason that this may not be workable.
Then there is the key issue of who is in military command of the peacekeepers. The U.S. says it must be NATO. The plan says the forces will be under overall UN jurisdiction. How the details are worked out could be critical.
Before the United States
and its roads blocked by bomb craters. Tim Marshall, Sky News, Belgrade.
And at the Ministry of Defense...
The makeup of the peacekeeping force for Kosovo has still to be agreed, and so has the command structure. But these British troops in Macedonia are trained and ready for any task that may face them. The men of the Irish Guards battle group will be ready to move into Kosovo within 4 hours of being given the signal by the politicians. The timetable is still being worked on, but the troops are keen to get the job done.
It'd be a bit of a relief for everyone, really, because we're just everyone's just sat around really waiting for the moment at the moment.
Well, we're trained up for it, so everything should be all right. We're fully trained for the job.
I think it's natural for a soldier, once he knows what he's supposed to do and once he feels prepared for it, to want to get on with it.
Combat engineers will be in the front line when the orders come to go into Kosovo. Their task to get the troops across the rivers NATO has denied to the Serbs by bombing the bridges. They'll also be clearing the minefields to allow the refugees back into their homes. David Cheta, Sky News, Macedonia.
And just a reminder.
Task force was cut short by a day, so the 3 assault ships could carry 2,200 Marines to Greece in preparation for possible peacekeeping duty in Kosovo. NATO already has 20,000 troops poised in neighboring Macedonia and Albania, including 5,000 U.S. soldiers deployed to protect Apache attack helicopters. Those soldiers could be part of the U.S. commitment of 7,000 troops. The peacekeepers will have to escort about 1 million refugees back to their homes while protecting them and at the same time disarm the Kosovar rebels who have been fighting for independence and who have given no indication they are willing to lay down their arms.
We have every confidence that if the Serb government intends and takes steps to comply with the agreement, that the KLA, consistent with their agreement at Rambouillet, would in fact work to carry this out.
NATO sources say under plans drawn up earlier this year, American troops will be assigned to patrol the eastern corner of Kosovo. Great Britain, with the largest number of troops, will take the central sector, including the provincial capital of Pristina, with France controlling the west, Italy the north, and Germany the south. Russian participation depends on resolving Russia's demands. Its troops remain under separate command from NATO. The next step, the Pentagon says, is some kind of military-to-military contact between NATO and Belgrade to work out exactly how 40,000 troops are going to leave Kosovo. But the Pentagon notes so far, not a single Serb soldier has budged. Jamie McIntyre, CNN, the Pentagon.
I was at the border. We conducted an action at the border. We thought that we killed 4 Serb soldiers. 2 of them were Serbs, but 2 of them were foreigners. 1 of them was still alive. When we went to take the weapons, the wounded one had a knife in his hand. When I approached him, he cut me. I shot him with my rifle. I thought he was dead, but he was alive. I killed him.
The harsh reality of fighting with the Kosovo Liberation Army can be seen in the story of Gülsü Marama. At just 7...
While NATO troops already in the Balkans are preparing for their new role, these British troops may have to move quickly into Kosovo. Troop numbers on the ground to police the peace still fall far short of the number military planners say they need. There are 16,000 NATO troops in Macedonia. The final force is planned to be around 50,000. There's also doubt, too, over who exactly will command the peacekeeping force. Hopes are growing now that NATO may soon escort the refugees home. Some observers are warning now, though, against triumphalism. NATO says now...
Troops here have been training for mine clearance. They expect to have to do a lot of that inside Kosovo. They believe Yugoslav forces will have left a carpet of mines.
Will make what's supposed to be a rapid withdrawal from Kosovo. Until they're really on their way out, uncertainty about this peace agreement will remain. Julian Mannion, ITN, Belgrade.
Macedonia on 24 hours' notice to move into Kosovo once they're given the order. The Allies say they're determined to grasp this chance of peace.
Even though it has taken 72 days to get to this point, we, within 72 hours, are determined to seize the momentum of peace.
The UN-led peacekeepers will take two main routes into Kosovo, from to Prizren and along the Lepnac Valley from Skopje in Macedonia to Pristina. First in will be special reconnaissance forces, likely to include members of the SAS. Their task to identify hazards such as minefields and wrecked bridges. The job of clearing the mines will be carried out by combat engineering squadrons, including those of the 4 Armoured Brigade. Kosovo is hostile territory. Rogue militia from both the Serbian side and the KLA are unlikely to pay much attention to the peace deal. The troops will be under constant threat from sniper fire and booby traps.
The prospect of small individual actions where people take issue with our arrival and try and probably just harass or slur us up by means of roadblocks and such like.
NATO do not yet have as many soldiers here as they'd like for the mission inside Kosovo. Even so, they can't afford to hang around for reinforcements. These troops are on 4 hours' notice to move into Kosovo after months of waiting. They expect that order to come through any time in the next few days.
Spelt out. This will make way for the first deployment of international troops, now assembled in the Balkans. Britain announced the dispatch of an extra 4,000 men, including paratroops and Gurkhas. This weekend, their sorties tonight, the Allies are out to ensure there'll be no welshing on the deal by the great backtracker of Belgrade. Graham Leach, Sky News.
Even if village captured by its soldiers in the last few days. Batusha lies a few kilometers inside Kosovo. Proof the KLA is making some progress against the Serbs. There's no indication, though, that the KLA is considering disarmament. As NATO attacks continue in the mountains, they're taking advantage of the confusion in the Serb army.
One thing is obvious. You can see by the way that they fire their artillery, they are very far away. Our scouts say the Serbs are confused and they are shooting at each other. This could be because some are trying to desert. They don't have many soldiers on the ground, only artillery.
Kosovo is littered with booby traps and mines. KLA fighters carefully pick their way through the rubble, showing that NATO's task of clearing a way for the refugees to return will not be an easy one. These pictures...
They're still in training, but not for much longer. These NATO troops know that any day now it will be the real thing at last. Their long-awaited entrance into Kosovo. British Army engineers will help spearhead the advance with mobile bridges. Tonight they were going through their final rehearsals. With Kosovo's infrastructure devastated, just getting around will not be easy. On top of that, though, there are the dangers to prepare for: landmines, unexploded bombs, booby traps, not to mention the possibility of renegade Serb soldiers who may decide to stay and fight rather than pull out.
maybe one or two who don't agree with the message they've been given. And so we face the prospect of small individual actions where people take issue with our arrival and try and probably just harass or slur us up by means of roadblocks and such like.
NATO do not yet have as many soldiers here as they'd like for the mission inside Kosovo. Even so, they can't afford to hang around for reinforcements.
These troops, who heads the NATO force for Kosovo, will meet Serb officers on the Kosovo-Macedonia border tomorrow to spell out how the pullout must go, including a timetable, routes to be used, and the order in which specific Serb units leave Kosovo. When they reach an agreement, the clock for the deadlines of the withdrawal will start running. The Serbs must take it on trust that NATO jets won't hit them and will keep the Kosovo Liberation Army from attacking the retreating troops. NATO will insist on verification. No one trusts Slobodan Milosevic, not even his own people, who are not happy with the deal he made.
We think it's zero.
Virtually all their strikes against Serb forces in Kosovo.
The pilots report that they've struck more than 24 tanks, armored personnel carriers, and pieces of artillery in Kosovo so far today.
The Serb forces have not begun to withdraw and are still battling the Kosovo Liberation Army and driving ethnic Albanians from their homes.
They're continuing to remove people from villages in various places. They do not seem to have changed their stripes.
Tomorrow, NATO will tell the Serbs they must begin their pullout in the southwest and move north and east, using in reverse the same routes the refugees used to flee into Albania and Macedonia.
These happen to be relatively major roads, and so it should be easy, relatively easy for them to move out.
But NATO airstrikes have destroyed much of the fuel the Serbs will need to drive their heavy equipment out, and many of the bridges they will need to cross have been bombed. There will be bottlenecks, but once the Serbs begin withdrawing, NATO will stop bombing, possibly as early as Sunday. Then the NATO peacekeeping force would begin moving in, led by British troops now on 24-hour standby in Macedonia.
We will be hot on the heels, let me put it that way, of the departing Yugoslav forces.
2,000 Marines aboard ships now steaming toward Greece will lead American troops into Kosovo. First, they will clear the roads of mines left by the Serbs, then get food to the estimated 500,000 refugees still trapped inside Kosovo.
It could
can only come when progress in discussions is followed by progress on the ground.
NATO generals will meet with Yugoslav military commanders Saturday to discuss a one-week withdrawal timetable. If the Serb retreat begins on schedule, the strikes will stop, and the Kosovo peacekeeping operation will begin.
Peacekeepers can move in before all of them are out, yeah.
Mr. Clinton spoke with Finnish President Martti Ahtisaari to thank him for pushing Belgrade to accept the peace plan. And he sent Russian President Boris Yeltsin a note praising Moscow's role in the diplomatic breakthrough. But there's still no agreement with Russia on a peacekeeping command structure, and NATO won't wait for a deal before sending troops into Kosovo.
On one hand, Russia...
Yugoslavia will begin hammering out details of a Serbian troop withdrawal from Kosovo and the return of refugees. The Russians will be there as mediators, a spokesman said. That may sound vague, but so far, so is the role Russian peacekeepers will play in Kosovo.
There will be a lot of proposals to solve this very complicated problem. The Russian military is working around the clock to hammer out options acceptable both for Russia, the UN Security Council, and Yugoslavia.
Friday, Russia's...
down the conditions for the withdrawal of more than 40,000 Yugoslav troops from Kosovo. And the Pentagon says if the Serbs move out smartly, NATO bombing could stop soon.
If Serbia cooperates, I think the bombing could be halted by the end of the weekend or very early next week.
But first, NATO observation planes must see the pullout and verify that anti-aircraft guns are silent. 3 refugee escape routes were spared bombing by NATO. Now Serb troops will have 7 days to use the roads to get through the provincial capital of Pristina into Serbia, where they will have to remain outside a 25-kilometer buffer zone. When NATO troops move in, the hard work begins.
There will be about 500,000 internally displaced persons in dire need of medical help and other assistance. There are over 850,000 refugees in the region that clearly want to return home as quickly as possible.
The first job will be to open main roads to food convoys from international aid agencies. The Serbs are supposed to tell NATO where they have mined and remove booby traps on bridges and highways. But NATO forces will have to clear some mines on primary routes. The first U.S. troops in will be 1,900 Marines now sailing to Greece. They're scheduled to move to a forward base in Macedonia by Tuesday, and in a week or so, they could be patrolling the eastern sector of Kosovo. While
the meeting,
we've actually got a new audience up in the hillside above Blace on the Serbian side of the border with Kosovo. We have a platoon of Serbian soldiers watching us, watching them. That's usually a sniper's position that is heavily mined, that area on the forefront of that hill, but they're equally interested as to what is going on here, when they will be able to get home, when they're going to withdraw from those positions you see them on right now. But of course we are waiting most of all for the initialing of this agreement at the technical military meeting which is going on at the moment. It's set to be a long one. They've got a lot of issues to work out, and then the refugees will be wanting to get back to their homeland. The veil will be lifting over Kosovo after this agreement is signed, and we'll be able to see the full horror of what's been perpetrated by the Serb military and paramilitary forces. But the Yugoslavian generals who are now inside the transport CAF, which is where the talks are going on, will want to be able to withdraw with some dignity. Now, there is some movement there. We don't know who that official is, but clearly some consultations going on there. We don't know how long this meeting will go on, but they've been given just today to get these details worked out, and then 7 days to get their troops moving away from their deployed positions inside Kosovo. But unless this meeting is successful, the bombing will go on. The Yugoslav generals know that. They've got to come to a verifiable agreement about getting their forces out of Kosovo. But at the moment we don't know how they're progressing. It's simply there's been nobody out to brief us on exactly how the talks are going at the moment.
well, the talks taking place there, as we can see live while you're talking, David, the talks at this Cafe Europa 93, a location which the Yugoslav delegation objected to earlier, hence the delay in the meeting. It is, of course, isn't it, a very significant location, because only months ago we saw literally tens of thousands of refugees crossing the border at exactly this point, fleeing from Kosovo.
Final preparations for Chinook helicopters to add to the military build-up in the Balkans. Operations dropped into top gear today. Chinooks from the base are the first of a dozen support and transport helicopters to leave. From here at RAF Odium in rural Hampshire, the helicopters will fly down through France, across the Mediterranean to Italy and on to the Balkans. It's the largest deployment of RAF support helicopters since the Gulf War. They'll be followed by a further 6 Chinooks and 4 smaller Pumas in the next few days. The ground equipment will be loaded on ships later this weekend. The Chinook's immediate destination is Macedonia, but soon they'll be operating over Kosovo.
We expect to be under the NATO command, but primarily we would expect to support the British forces there.
In terms of the flying that goes on down there, it's getting hot, it's quite high down there. What are the sort of problems that they're going to expect physically in terms of actual aviation?
The temperatures and the height do affect helicopter performance, so we would not expect to be able to lift what we would lift in, say, the British environment. So it is a much more demanding environment for the aircrew.
But the Chinook is a heavy lifter, capable of carrying 10 tons, supplies, guns or 44 troops. In Kosovo, the helicopters could be used for casualty evacuation, helping the United Nations as well as NATO. Although the military situation in Kosovo should be what NATO calls permissive, the Royal Air Force is under no illusions. These helicopter crews are fully equipped and prepared for war. Paul Beaver, Sky News at RAF Odium.
No start of the talks. Reports that the hold-up came from the Serb side proved inaccurate. NATO said it was because they were reworking details of their documents. On hills nearby, Serb troops watched as the talks began, which could lead to an immediate end to the fighting. Security on the ground remains tight. Maps were taken into the meeting to help with the logistical arrangements. NATO wants to know how and when Yugoslav forces will leave Kosovo, as well as details of which routes out troops will take and details of landmines. Once the withdrawal is underway, NATO says Yugoslav forces will have 1 week to leave Kosovo entirely.
As these military...
Britain's reinforcements for the Balkans have been leaving their bases today as NATO moves towards crossing the Kosovo border. The Ministry of Defence is moving at breakneck speed.
We have some 5,500 British military personnel already in Macedonia. A further 1,900 personnel are deploying immediately.
First off this morning were the Hercules transport aircraft carrying the first of these 11,000 extra troops. Essential equipment also left from RAF Lynham. Flying from their southern England bases were the first of a dozen transport helicopters, including these giant Chinooks. From here at RAF Odium in rural Hampshire, the helicopters will fly down through France, across the Mediterranean to Italy, and on to the Balkans. It's the largest deployment of RAF support helicopters since the Gulf War. And later this weekend, the first members of the Parachute Regiment will leave from RAF Brize Norton. They'll be followed by soldiers of the Royal Gurkha Rifles and the Royal Irish Regiment. Their Saxon armoured vehicles are leaving by sea. They will be joined by signallers and military policemen, whose role is to mark the routes into Kosovo. By next Thursday then, the NATO forces on the Kosovo border will be ready to move. It's expected that the British Army will take the lead. Paul Beaver, Sky News at RAF Odium.
Their base in the south of England bound for the Balkans. 4,000 extra British troops are on their way to the region. The British Ministry of Defence wants another 4,000 to be in place by next weekend, all part of the International Peace Implementation Force known as KFOR. There's a question mark still, though, over the role of the Russian peacekeepers. Moscow is unwilling to place them under NATO command. NATO's concerned those separate commands could mean the division of Kosovo. NATO troops were keeping a watchful eye on proceedings in Blace. Their role will become very different if the peace deal is accepted. Military planners believe they could enter Kosovo as early as next weekend. Their job then to make the province safe for the return of around 1 million refugees.